The estate of stood in austere silence, its towering stone walls untouched by warmth despite the golden light that spilled across its vast gardens each morning. Servants moved with careful precision through its corridors, their footsteps softened by thick carpets, their voices lowered as though even sound itself was unwelcome. At the center of this disciplined stillness lived Duke, a man whose presence commanded respect yet offered no comfort. His name carried power across the region, but within his own home, it echoed with an emptiness no one dared acknowledge aloud. He was a man shaped by restraint, every gesture measured, every word deliberate, every emotion buried beneath layers of control. Those who served him knew better than to expect kindness, they valued predictability instead. The Duke was never cruel without reason, but neither was he gentle without purpose. To him, relationships were arrangements, not bonds, and loyalty was something earned through duty, not affection. And yet within this rigid world, there existed a quiet contradiction. Her name was. She did not belong to the coldness of, though she had lived within its walls for nearly 2 years. Where the estate was severe, she was soft. Where the Duke was distant, she was attentive. Her presence did not disrupt the order of the household, but it altered its texture in ways too subtle for most to notice. A vase of fresh flowers placed where no one had thought to look. A meal prepared with consideration rather than mere instruction. A lamp left lit in a hallway where darkness lingered too long. Never demanded recognition for these things. She simply gave as though it were the most natural thing in the world. Her connection to the Duke had been arranged under circumstances neither romantic nor entirely impersonal. Officially, she was to become his wife, a union forged for stability, not affection. Yet even within that understanding, she had carried a quiet hope that something more might grow, not grand passion perhaps, but at least acknowledgement, a shared glance, a softened tone, some small sign that she was seen. But did not see what he did not seek. On most evenings would wait in the drawing room, a book open in her hands though her eyes rarely moved across the pages. She listened instead for the distant sound of the Duke's return. When at last he entered, she would rise, offering a gentle greeting that was always met with a brief nod or at best a few clipped words. He never lingered. Conversations were transactions to him, not connections. Still, she persisted. Not out of naivety, but out of patience. She learned his preferences without being told. The precise way he took his tea, the silence he preferred after long meetings, the subtle tension in his shoulders when something troubled him, even if he never spoke of it. She did not intrude upon his solitude, but she remained near enough that, if he ever chose otherwise, she would be there. He never chose otherwise. It was on an evening much like any other that the fragile balance between them finally broke. The sky had dimmed into a soft gray and a faint chill lingered in the air, stood by the tall windows of the study, watching as the last light faded beyond the gardens. The room was one the Duke rarely allowed others to enter, yet she had come with a purpose that felt, for once, impossible to ignore. He stood behind his desk, reviewing documents, his expression as composed as ever. He did not look up when she entered, though he was undoubtedly aware of her presence. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice even, his attention still fixed on the papers before him. "I know," replied quietly, stepping further into the room, "but I hoped you might allow it just this once." That was enough to draw his gaze. His eyes, sharp and unyielding, settled on her with a faint trace of impatience. "State your reason." For a moment she hesitated, not because she lacked courage, but because she understood what was at risk. Still, something within her, something long restrained, refused to remain silent any longer. "You've been unwell these past few days," she said gently. "You haven't rested properly and you've hardly eaten, I thought perhaps." "That is not your concern." The interruption was swift, precise, and absolute. Felt the words settle heavily between them, but she did not retreat, not this time. "I know it may not be my place," she continued, her voice steady despite the quiet tension building within her, "but I am to be your wife. I believe that allows me at least some right to care." Silence followed. It was not the comfortable kind she had grown used to, but something sharper, edged with disapproval. The Duke set his papers aside slowly, his gaze never leaving her. When he spoke, his tone had cooled further, if such a thing were possible. "You misunderstand your position." The words were deliberate, each one placed with care. His fingers tightened slightly at her sides, though her expression remained composed. "Then help me understand it." For the briefest moment, something flickered in his eyes, irritation perhaps, or the faintest hint of something more complex, but it vanished as quickly as it appeared. "There is a line," he said, his voice low but unwavering, "one that separates duty from presumption." She held his gaze, her heart steady even as something within her began to fracture. "And where do I stand?" It was then that he delivered the words that would linger long after the moment had passed. "Don't cross the line," he said, "you're not mine." The statement fell with a finality that left no room for interpretation. For a heartbeat, the world seemed to still. Did not react immediately. There were no tears, no raised voice, no visible sign of the impact those words had carved into her. Instead, she simply stood there, absorbing them in silence, as though committing them to memory. "I see," she said at last. There was no bitterness in her tone, no accusation, only a quiet clarity that had not been there before. She inclined her head slightly, a gesture of respect that now felt more like closure than deference. Then, without another word, she turned and walked toward the door. The Duke did not stop her. He watched her leave with the same detached composure he applied to everything else, as though nothing of consequence had occurred. To him, it was merely a correction, a necessary reminder of boundaries that should never have been questioned. But as the door closed softly behind her, something shifted within the vast, silent estate. That night did not wait in the drawing room, and for the first time since she had arrived at, she began to consider what it meant to truly leave. Morning arrived at without announcement, its pale light stretching across the stone floors as though searching for something it could not find. The estate functioned as it always had, precise, orderly, and silent, but there was a subtle imbalance beneath the routine, like a rhythm that had lost one of its essential beats. Servants carried out their duties with the same discipline, yet their movements hesitated in small, unspoken ways, as if expecting a presence that no longer filled the spaces they crossed. Was gone. Her absence was not marked by chaos or disruption. There were no overturned chairs, no hurried whispers of scandal. Instead, it revealed itself through absence alone, through the lack of quiet gestures that had once softened the estate's rigid edges. The vase in the east corridor remained empty. The lamp near the staircase had not been lit the night before. Even the air felt different, stripped of something intangible yet undeniably real. Duke noticed none of this at first. When he entered the dining room that morning, his steps were as measured as ever, his expression unchanged. He took his seat without hesitation, expecting the same seamless routine that had governed his household for years. Breakfast was served promptly, arranged with the same precision he demanded, yet he paused briefly as he lifted his cup. The tea was correct, exactly as he preferred. And yet he found himself setting it down after a single sip. There was no immediate reason for the gesture, no clear dissatisfaction he could name. Still, something about it felt incomplete, as though the act itself had lost its quiet certainty. He dismissed the thought as trivial, turning his attention instead to the documents awaiting him. "Where is Lady?" The question emerged without intent, spoken more out of habit than concern. A servant standing nearby lowered his gaze. "She has departed, Your Grace." His hand stilled. "Departed," he repeated, his tone neutral. "Yes, Your Grace, she left the estate early this morning." There was a pause, brief but perceptible, before he spoke again. "Was there a message?" "No, Your Grace." The Duke inclined his head slightly, as though acknowledging a minor inconvenience rather than a significant absence. "Very well." He did not ask further questions. To him, her departure was an act of quiet defiance, perhaps, or a moment of misplaced emotion. Either way, it was temporary, was not the type to vanish entirely. She would return once she had regained her composure. That, he believed, was simply her nature. The day continued. Meetings were held, decisions were made, and the affairs of the estate progressed without interruption. Yet as the hours passed, the subtle imbalance within grew more pronounced. It was not disorder that unsettled him, but the persistence of order without meaning. By evening, the realization began to take shape. He entered the drawing room out of habit, expecting nothing and yet pausing just inside the doorway. The chair by the window stood empty, the book that usually rested upon its arm absent. The space held no sign that it had ever been occupied, and yet the absence itself felt deliberate, as though something had been carefully removed rather than simply forgotten. He turned away almost immediately. The following days passed with increasing discomfort. Did not return. At first, regarded the situation with quiet irritation. Her absence disrupted nothing of importance, yet its persistence suggested an intention he did not appreciate. It was one thing to withdraw briefly, it was another to abandon her position without explanation. Such behavior bordered on impropriety, and he found himself considering the implications more out of principle than concern. But irritation, like all things rooted in assumption, began to erode under the weight of reality. By the fourth day, the absence could no longer be dismissed. It revealed itself in moments he could not anticipate, a document left unsigned because no one had anticipated his preference for its arrangement, a meal prepared precisely yet lacking the subtle adjustments he had never thought to name. Even the silence, once a constant he valued, had shifted into something heavier, less controlled. It was not the absence of sound that unsettled him. It was the absence of presence. That realization did not come easily. He resisted it at first, dismissing each instance as coincidence, each discomfort as trivial. Yet the pattern persisted, weaving itself through his days with quiet insistence, and with it came something far less familiar than irritation. Awareness. He began to remember. Not grand gestures or dramatic moments, but fragments, small, inconsequential things he had never considered worth noting. The way she adjusted the curtains to soften the morning light, the quiet efficiency with which she resolved minor inconveniences before they reached him, the steadiness of her presence, always near yet never intrusive. And beneath those memories, something else began to surface. Her voice, soft, measured, and patient. I thought perhaps, that is not your concern. He recalled the moment with increasing clarity, each word sharpening as though time itself had chosen to refine them. I am to be your wife. You misunderstand your position. There is a line. Don't cross it. You're not mine. The final words lingered longest. They had been spoken without hesitation, without doubt, as though they were nothing more than a simple truth, and yet now, in the quiet that followed her absence, they felt different. Not like a boundary, like a dismissal. Set aside the document in his hand, his thoughts no longer aligned with the task before him. The room around him remained unchanged, precise, orderly, silent, but the stillness no longer brought clarity. It brought recognition. She had not argued. She had not protested. She had simply accepted his words. And then she had left. The simplicity of that realization unsettled him more than any confrontation could have. There had been no demand, no expectation placed upon him, only a quiet withdrawal that now stretched into something far more permanent than he had anticipated. For the first time, he considered a possibility he had previously dismissed. She might not return. The thought lingered, unwelcome yet persistent, refusing to be ignored. It carried with it an unfamiliar weight, one that settled deeply despite his efforts to remain detached. He rose from his chair, moving toward the window without conscious intent. The gardens beyond remained as they always had, immaculate, untouched, and devoid of any trace of change. Yet as he stood there, observing the stillness, he found himself searching for something he could not name. Or perhaps something he now could. It was not the estate that had changed. It was his understanding of it. And within that realization, something shifted. Not dramatically, not enough to alter his composure, but enough to fracture the certainty he had long relied upon. The boundaries he had drawn so carefully no longer felt as solid as they once had. They felt empty. Exhaled slowly, his gaze lingering on the horizon as the last light of day began to fade. Then, for the first time since her departure, he gave the matter his full attention. Find her, he said quietly. The command was simple, but it carried a weight that had not existed before. This was no longer about correction. It was about understanding what had been lost and whether it could still be found. The village where settled did not announce itself with grandeur, nor did it attempt to impress those who arrived within its boundaries. It rested quietly between rolling fields and narrow dirt paths, its modest homes built close enough for voices to carry but far enough to preserve solitude. There was no excess here, no rigid expectation of perfection, and for the first time in years found herself breathing without restraint. Her days unfolded with a simplicity that felt unfamiliar at first. She woke with the sunrise, not to fulfill a duty imposed upon her, but because the light itself invited her into the morning. The small cottage she occupied required care, yet it did not demand more than she could give. Each task, sweeping the floor, preparing her meals, tending to the narrow garden outside, became an act of quiet ownership rather than obligation. There was peace in that. Not the fragile kind she had once known, dependent on another's mood or presence, but something steadier, rooted in her own choices. She no longer listened for distant footsteps or measured her words against an invisible boundary. The silence around her was not heavy, it was open, allowing her thoughts to settle without interruption. Yet peace did not erase memory. There were moments, often uninvited, when her mind returned to, not to its grandeur or its discipline, but to the spaces she had once occupied within it. The drawing room where she had waited, the corridors she had softened with small, unnoticed gestures, the study where everything had changed. You're not mine. The words no longer cut as sharply as they once had, but they had not vanished. Instead, they lingered as a reminder not of rejection but of clarity. She had crossed no line that night, she had only reached beyond one that had never been hers to claim. And so she had left. That understanding had shaped her more than the pain itself. In the weeks that followed her departure, discovered a strength she had not been forced to use before. It revealed itself not in grand declarations or dramatic change, but in consistency. She worked where work was needed, offered kindness without expectation, and accepted neither more nor less than what was given in return. There was no performance in her actions now, no quiet hope that someone might finally notice. She noticed herself. That, she realized, was enough. Far from the village, the man she had left behind struggled to understand a world that no longer aligned with his expectations. Duke had always believed that control was a matter of will. If something required correction, it could be addressed. If something disrupted order, it could be removed or replaced. Yet as the days stretched into weeks, he found himself confronting a reality that resisted every instinct he possessed. Could not be replaced. The search for her began with efficiency, as all his actions did. He issued instructions, dispatched inquiries, and followed the most logical paths first. Records were checked, routes were traced, and every possible destination was considered with careful precision. Each effort returned the same result. Nothing. At first, he interpreted this as an error in execution. Information had been missed, details overlooked. He expanded the search, extended its reach, and increased its urgency. Still, the outcome remained unchanged. She had not left a trail. This, more than anything, unsettled him. It suggested intention, a deliberate choice to remove herself completely from the world he controlled. The realization forced him to confront something he had not considered before. She had not left impulsively. She had prepared. The thought lingered as he reviewed each report, each empty conclusion reinforcing what he had failed to see, had understood her departure long before he had recognized its possibility. She had moved forward while he remained fixed in place, bound by assumptions that no longer held weight. For the first time, his authority felt irrelevant. That awareness did not come easily. He resisted it, questioned it, attempted to reframe it within the logic he trusted, yet each attempt led him back to the same conclusion: this was not a matter of control. It was a matter of understanding. And understanding required something he had long avoided: reflection. The process was neither immediate nor comfortable. It unfolded gradually, forcing him to revisit moments he had once dismissed as inconsequential, conversations he had ended too quickly, silences he had allowed to stretch without consideration, gestures he had ignored because they required no response. He began to see them differently, not as isolated instances but as a pattern. She had offered presence. He had offered distance. The imbalance, once invisible to him, now stood unmistakably clear. It followed him through every space within, the study where he had drawn the line, the dining room where her absence now lingered. Even the corridors seemed altered, as though the structure itself reflected the emptiness he had failed to acknowledge. Eventually, the estate could no longer contain the weight of that realization. Made a decision, not as a duke issuing commands, but as a man confronting his own failure. He would find her himself. The journey stripped away the last remnants of certainty he had relied upon. Without the immediate reach of his authority, he was forced to engage with the world directly, to ask rather than instruct, to listen rather than assume. Each step carried him further from the rigid structure that had defined him and closer to something far less predictable. Humility. It was not a quality he had cultivated, yet it emerged with each unanswered question, each moment of uncertainty. He encountered people who knew nothing of his title and cared even less. To them, he was simply a man searching for someone he had lost. And for the first time, that was enough. The search was neither swift nor straightforward. It demanded patience, persistence, and a willingness to accept that he might not succeed. There were moments when doubts surfaced, questioning the purpose of his pursuit, challenging the belief that anything could be restored. He did not turn back, because beneath the uncertainty, something had changed. He no longer sought to correct a mistake. He sought to face it. When he finally reached the village, it was not by design but by accumulation, a series of small leads that, taken together, guided him to a place he might once have overlooked entirely. It was quiet, unremarkable, and yet, as he stood at its edge, a sense of recognition settled within him. Not certainty but possibility. He moved forward without hesitation, his gaze steady as it passed over the narrow paths and modest homes. There was no clear direction, no immediate indication that his search would end here. Until he saw her, stood just beyond a low wooden fence, her attention focused on the small garden before her. Her movements were unhurried, her expression calm, untouched by the tension that had once defined her presence within. She looked different, not in appearance but in something deeper, something that could not be altered by time alone. She looked complete, stopped. For the first time since he had begun his search, he did not move forward. Because in that moment, one truth became unmistakably clear. Winning her back would not be a matter of finding her. It would be a matter of becoming someone worthy of being found. Remain where he stood, the distance between himself and no more than a few measured steps, yet heavier than any boundary he had ever drawn. The air carried the faint scent of earth and growing things, a quiet contrast to the rigid stillness of. She had not noticed him yet, her attention fixed on the small garden she tended with steady care, as though each movement belonged entirely to her. For a moment, he allowed himself to observe without interruption. There was no hesitation in her posture, no subtle tension waiting to be concealed. She moved with a calm certainty that had once been absent, as though the uncertainty he had imposed upon her no longer existed. It was not simply that she had left his world, it was that she had built one of her own. The realization settled heavily within him, not as regret alone but as understanding. He stepped forward. The soft sound of his movement against the dirt path was enough to draw her attention, turned her gaze meeting his without surprise, yet not without awareness. There was a brief stillness between them, one that carried recognition without invitation. "Your Grace," she said, her voice composed. The formality of the address did not escape him. He replied, her name unfamiliar on his lips, in a way that revealed how rarely he had spoken it before. Silence followed, not strained but deliberate. Neither of them rushed to fill it, as though both understood that whatever came next could not be forced into ease. "You found me," she said at last. It was a statement, not a question. "Yes." He did not offer an explanation beyond that. The effort of his search, the distance he had traveled, the persistence he had maintained, none of it felt appropriate to present as justification. They were consequences, not offerings. Her gaze lingered on him briefly, assessing rather than reacting. Why? The question was simple, yet it demanded more than a simple answer. Did not respond immediately. For perhaps the first time, he allowed himself to consider his words fully before speaking, not to maintain control but to ensure honesty. "Because I was wrong," he said. The admission did not come easily, but once spoken, it did not falter. His expression did not change, though something in her eyes sharpened slightly, as though testing the weight of his words. "In what way?" she asked. He met her gaze steadily. "In believing that distance was strength, in thinking that indifference protected me, in failing to see what you offered and in dismissing it when it required acknowledgement." Each statement was measured, not rehearsed, but carefully understood. There was no attempt to soften them, no effort to reduce their impact. "And in what you said," she added quietly. The memory remained between them, unspoken yet unmistakable. "Yes." The single word carried no resistance. He continued, his voice steady. "I drew a line where there should have been none, not because you crossed it, but because I refused to move beyond it." Regarded him in silence, her attention unwavering. There was no visible anger in her expression, but neither was there immediate acceptance. What she offered instead was something far more difficult to face. "Consideration." "You were clear," she said. "You told me exactly where I stood. And I was wrong to do so." Her gaze shifted slightly, not away from him, but inward, as though weighing something that could not be resolved by his words alone. "You didn't force me to stay," she continued, "but you made it impossible to remain." The distinction was precise, and it settled between them with quiet finality. "I understand that now," he said. "Do you?" she asked. There was no challenge in her tone, only a need for certainty. "Did not hesitate, yes." He took a step closer, though he remained mindful of the space she had claimed as her own. "Not because I have reconsidered the situation, but because I have changed within it. I no longer see what you offered as an intrusion. I see it as something I failed to value." The honesty in his voice was unadorned, stripped of the authority that had once defined him. His fingers tightened slightly around the edge of the fence beside her, a small, unconscious movement that did not go unnoticed. "And what is it you expect now?" she asked. "Nothing," he replied. The answer came without hesitation. Her brows drew together faintly, not in confusion but in quiet scrutiny. "You came all this way for nothing." "I came to speak the truth," he said, "not to demand a response to it." The distinction altered the space between them in a way neither of them could ignore. "I will not ask you to return," he continued. "I will not assume that you should. What I said before made it clear that I did not consider you mine. I understand now that I had no right to define that in the first place." Studied him carefully, as though searching for any trace of the certainty he had once carried. "And if I choose not to go back?" she asked. "Then you will remain here," he said simply, "and I will leave." There was no hesitation in the answer, no attempt to negotiate its outcome. "And that will be enough for you?" "No," he said, "but it will be what I have earned." The quiet certainty of his response shifted something in her expression, not softening it, but altering its focus. She stepped away from the fence, closing a small portion of the distance between them, though not enough to erase it entirely. "You've changed," she said. "I am trying to." The correction was subtle but intentional. Exhaled slowly, her gaze drifting briefly toward the garden before returning to him. Change is not something that can be proven in a moment, she said. It takes time, consistency. As I know. And trust, she added. The word lingered between them, carrying more weight than any accusation could have. Inclined his head slightly. I will not ask for it, but I am willing to earn it if you allow me the opportunity. She considered that carefully, her silence no longer distant but engaged. And if I do, then I will accept that. The answer remained steady. Held his gaze for a long moment, searching not for perfection but for truth. What she found was not the man she had left behind, but neither was it someone entirely unfamiliar. The distance between those two versions had been shaped by something real, something she could not dismiss as easily as before. You said I wasn't yours, she murmured. I did. And now? Met her gaze without hesitation. Now I understand that I was never meant to possess you, only to stand beside you if you chose it. The words settled into the quiet space between them, unforced and complete. Looked at him for a long moment, then stepped closer, closing the distance just enough to change its meaning. I won't return to the way things were, she said. Nor would I ask you to. If there is anything between us, she continued, it will be built from here, not from what was left behind. Nodded, then we begin from here. The simplicity of the agreement carried more weight than any declaration. For the first time, the space between them no longer felt like a boundary. It felt like a choice. And this time, neither of them turned away.